There's a stone pillar standing in southern Turkey that shouldn't exist. Not in the way most ancient mysteries shouldn't exist, where the engineering seems too advanced or the alignment too precise. This one shouldn't exist because the people who carved it weren't supposed to be people yet, not in the way we understand civilization. They hadn't invented pottery. They hadn't domesticated wheat. They were hunters who followed herds across seasonal grasslands, who knew the taste of wild gazelle and the sound of wind through tall grass. Yet somehow they moved stones weighing 16 tons, carved intricate reliefs of scorpions and vultures and foxes with exquisite detail, and built circular enclosures that required an understanding of geometry, astronomy, and social organization that wouldn't appear again for another 6,000 years. The pillar I'm thinking of, known to archaeologists as Pillar 43, Enclosure D, stands 5.5 meters tall. On its weathered surface, carved in low relief, is a scene that has sparked one of the most intriguing debates in archaeology. Some see it as a primitive attempt at decoration, animals chosen at random. Others see something far more specific, a date stamp, a warning, a memorial to the worst day in human history since the end of the Ice Age. And still others, looking at the same carvings with different eyes entirely, see evidence of something that mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge. They see the fingerprints of the Anunnaki, ancient beings from Sumerian myth who supposedly descended from the heavens to shape humanity's destiny. And they suggest that this site, Göbekli Tepe, was not built by Stone Age hunters at all, but was instead an extraterrestrial temple, a sacred complex constructed by beings whose names would echo through millennia: Enlil, Enki, Anu, gods who are perhaps not gods at all, but visitors from a distant world. Tonight, as your thoughts begin to drift and your breathing slows, I'm going to take you to that hilltop in southeastern Turkey. We're going to walk through those ancient stone circles, run our fingers across carvings made 12,000 years ago, and explore one of the most compelling and controversial questions in alternative archaeology. Was Göbekli Tepe an Anunnaki temple? The question itself opens doors to deeper mysteries about who we are, where we came from, and whether the boundary between myth and history is as clear as we've been taught to believe. Close your eyes if you'd like. You won't need visuals for this journey. The world I'm building exists better in shadow, in the space between memory and history, in the quiet hours when the modern world recedes and the ancient past feels closer than it should. Before we go deeper, if this kind of exploration resonates with you, a quiet like helps others find these stories. I'm curious, where in the world are you drifting off from tonight? What time is it there? Drop a comment and let me know. And remember, this is a journey without pressure, without urgency. Let the story unfold at its own pace, like smoke rising from an ancient fire, like wind moving through those Turkish highlands where the stones still wait, patient as they've been for 100 centuries. The story begins not with gods or aliens, but with an archaeologist. His name was Klaus Schmidt, a German prehistorian with an eye for patterns that others missed. Born in December 1953 in Feuchtwangen, Bavaria, Schmidt had spent his career studying the deep past, the periods when humans first began the long transition from hunter-gatherers to farmers, from nomadic wanderers to settled villagers. He'd worked at sites across the Near East, learning to read the language of broken pottery and buried post holes, developing an almost intuitive sense for when something didn't fit the expected patterns. On a bright October day in 1994, Schmidt stood on a low hill in the Gurmush mountain range of southeastern Anatolia, about 15 kilometers northeast of the modern Turkish city of Şanlıurfa. The landscape around him was harsh, beautiful in its austerity, a high plateau where wheat fields gave way to rocky outcrops and the sky seemed impossibly vast. The locals called the hill Göbekli Tepe, which translates simply to Potbelly Hill, a reference to its rounded shape rising above the surrounding plains like an ancient belly swollen with secrets. American and Turkish archaeologists had surveyed the site briefly in 1963, part of a broader survey of the region. They'd noted the presence of worked stone slabs scattered across the surface, limestone fragments that suggested human activity, but they'd dismissed it as nothing more than the remains of a Byzantine cemetery, one of countless ruins dotting the Near East. Interesting, perhaps, but not exceptional. Schmidt, however, had recently been working at a site called Nevlu Chori, located along the Middle Euphrates about 60 kilometers to the northeast. There, his team had uncovered something unexpected: large T-shaped limestone pillars associated with pre-pottery Neolithic structures. These pillars had revolutionized understanding of that period, showing that people 10,000 years ago had been capable of architectural ambitions far beyond what anyone had suspected. When Schmidt heard about Göbekli Tepe, about the limestone fragments on its surface, something clicked in his mind. He wondered if what the earlier survey had missed was exactly what he'd learned to recognize at Nevaluchori. He walked the site systematically, examining the stones, noting their shapes and positions. What he saw made his pulse quicken. These weren't just random fragments. Some of them had the distinctive T-shape he'd become so familiar with, but they were larger, cruder in some ways, but also more massive than anything at Nevaluchori. If similar pillars were buried here, if this hill contained structures like the ones he'd excavated, then it wasn't a Byzantine cemetery at all. It was something far older, far more significant. Schmidt made inquiries in the nearby villages, using a method archaeologists had employed for generations, asking locals about stones, about unusual finds, about anything that might indicate what lay beneath the surface. An old man told him about flint, lots of flint scattered across the hilltop. Flint was the signature material of the Neolithic, the Stone Age, used for making tools and weapons before humans learned to work metal. Byzantine cemeteries didn't produce flint, but Neolithic sites did in abundance. But Schmidt saw something different. As he walked across the tell, the artificial mound created by millennia of human occupation, he noticed the distinctive shape of some of the stones protruding from the earth. They were T-shaped, massive limestone monoliths, whose forms reminded him of pillars he'd excavated at another site called Nevaluchori, located along the Middle Euphrates. Those pillars had been dated to the pre-pottery Neolithic period, a time when humans were supposedly just beginning the slow transition from mobile hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. Finding similar structures here, in this unremarkable hilltop, suggested something extraordinary. Schmidt made a decision that would reshape our understanding of human history. He secured funding from the German Archaeological Institute and the German Research Foundation, assembled a team of specialists, and in spring 1995 returned to Göbekli Tepe to begin what would become a 20-year excavation project that would consume the rest of his life. The work began with a surface survey, methodically walking the entire tell, collecting and documenting every artifact visible on the ground. The team found thousands of flint tools, scrapers and blades and points, the debris of tool-making scattered across centuries. They found fragments of carved stone, pieces that clearly had once been part of larger sculptures, and they found, protruding slightly from the soil, the tops of what could only be massive worked pillars. The first test trench was opened at the base of the southeastern slope, where modern activity had cut through the ancient layers. What they found there was a terrazzo floor, a carefully prepared surface made of crushed limestone, smooth and level extending into the unexcavated areas. This wasn't the Byzantine cemetery the earlier survey had reported. This was Neolithic, and it was massive. As they excavated upward and inward, moving from the slope toward the summit of the tell, the scale of what lay buried became clear. Beneath the accumulated soil of 12 millennia, beneath the wind-blown dust and the decomposed vegetation and the slow accumulation of time, they found massive circular and oval enclosures, stone circles built around pairs of enormous T-shaped pillars. Not one circle, but many. As of the time of Schmidt's death in 2014, geophysical surveys and excavation had identified more than 20 separate enclosures across the site, though only a handful had been fully excavated. Each enclosure followed a similar pattern. A roughly circular wall, built of limestone blocks carefully fitted together, with massive T-shaped pillars embedded into the inner surface of the wall, protruding upward and inward like silent sentinels. The wall pillars varied in size, most between 3 and 4 meters tall, some weighing several tons, and at the center of each enclosure, standing in pairs, facing each other across the interior space, were the central pillars, the largest and most impressive monoliths. Enclosure D, the largest and best preserved of the structures, became the iconic image of Göbekli Tepe, the one that appeared in documentaries and textbooks and captured the public imagination. Its circular wall had a diameter of approximately 20 meters. 11 large pillars were embedded in the wall, each carved with unique assemblages of animals. And in the center stood the 2 colossal central pillars, designated by the excavation team as Pillars 18 and 31. These central pillars were masterworks of Neolithic engineering. Pillar 31, the western central pillar, measured 5.5 meters tall. Pillar 18, the eastern central pillar, was slightly shorter at 5.4 metres. Both weighed approximately 10 metric tons. They had been carved from a single piece of limestone quarried from the bedrock of the tell itself, shaped and decorated while still partially attached to the living rock, then somehow extracted, transported, and erected in their final positions. The pedestals on which they stood were shallow, only 20 centimetres deep, carved directly from the bedrock floor of the enclosure. This meant the stability of these massive pillars relied entirely on precise engineering, on perfectly calculated weight distribution and careful placement. One miscalculation and 10 tons of limestone would have toppled, possibly shattering, yet they stood. For more than 11,000 years, through countless earthquakes, through the weight of the earth that was deliberately piled on top of them when the site was abandoned, through everything, they stood. When Schmidt's team carefully excavated around Pillar 18 and raised it to its original upright position in spring 2010, using modern equipment and great caution, they were the first people to see it fully revealed in more than 10 millennia. The pillars themselves were works of art. The T-shape, which had seemed abstract at first, revealed itself to be anthropomorphic. The horizontal top of the T represented a head in profile, the vertical shaft a body. Many of the central pillars, and some of the wall pillars, had been carved with additional details that confirmed this interpretation. Arms bent at the elbow, positioned along the sides of the shaft. Hands brought together at the belly, fingers carefully delineated. Items of clothing, belts carved in relief around the middle of the pillar, sometimes decorated with geometric patterns or small carved animals. One pillar even showed what appeared to be a loincloth. These were not mere columns. They were representations of beings, perhaps ancestors, perhaps something else entirely. The level of skill required to create these carvings was extraordinary. The Stone Age toolkit available to the builders of Göbekli Tepe consisted of stone. Flint for cutting and scraping, harder stones like quartzite for pounding and shaping, no metal, no steel chisels or iron hammers. To carve these pillars, to create the smooth surfaces and precise details of the reliefs, required patience beyond modern comprehension, skill developed over generations, and a level of artistic vision that speaks to sophisticated aesthetic sense. Many of the pillars were decorated not just with anthropomorphic features, but with elaborate animal reliefs, carved in both low and high relief. The bestiary of Göbekli Tepe reads like a catalogue of the Neolithic world's most impressive creatures. Foxes appear frequently, rendered with remarkable naturalism, their pointed snouts and bushy tails unmistakable, often shown with teeth bared in aggressive display. Wild boars appear in multiple enclosures, massive and powerful, tusks prominent, bodies tense with implied motion. Aurochs, the wild cattle that were ancestors of modern domesticated cattle, appear with heads lowered, horns forward, ready to charge. Birds are everywhere, vultures with wings spread wide, heads turned to face the viewer with unsettling directness. Cranes standing tall on long legs, waterfowl that might be ducks or geese. These aren't generic bird shapes. Each species is rendered with attention to anatomical detail, suggesting the artists observed their subjects carefully, knew the difference between a vulture's wing structure and a crane's posture. Snakes are perhaps the most common motif of all. They appear as individuals, coiled and ready to strike. They appear in groups, multiple serpents moving in parallel waves across the surface of a pillar, creating a hypnotic rippling effect. On one pillar, more than a dozen snakes move together in perfect alignment, their bodies forming a living textile of scales and motion. The precision of these carvings, the way each snake is distinct yet part of a larger pattern, speaks to mathematical thinking, to understanding of symmetry and repetition. Scorpions appear with their stingers raised, the segmentation of their bodies carefully detailed. There are lions or leopards, large felines with teeth bared. There are spiders, their legs spread wide. There are creatures that are harder to identify, possibly wild asses or gazelles, rendered in profile with careful attention to the line of the back, the curve of the neck. Most remarkably, almost all of the identifiable animals are male, and most are shown in aggressive or threatening postures. This is not decoration. This is intentional communication, a symbolic system whose meaning we can only guess at. Were these animals clan totems? Were they representations of spiritual guardians? Were they warnings? Were they teaching tools, a way of encoding knowledge about the natural world? And scattered among the animals are abstract symbols whose meanings remain entirely mysterious. H shapes, some tall and narrow, some short and wide, crescents like stylized moons, circles and discs, geometric patterns that might be proto-writing or might be purely decorative. On one pillar, a series of repeating shapes that look uncannily like handbags, rectangular forms with curved tops, appear along the upper edge of the T-shaped head. These same handbag symbols appear in ancient art from Mesopotamia and, intriguingly, from Mesoamerica, thousands of miles and thousands of years removed. What they meant, what they signified, remains one of Göbekli Tepe's many unsolved riddles. The floor of the enclosures had been treated with the same care as the walls and pillars. The bedrock had been carefully smoothed, and in some places covered with terrazzo, the crushed limestone floor that created a level, almost polished surface. In the centre of some enclosures, between the two central pillars, archaeologists found shallow carved basins, their purpose unknown, for offerings, for fire, for some ritual we cannot imagine. Around the enclosures, the excavation revealed something else, evidence of massive feasting. The fill dirt between the enclosures and in the spaces around them contained enormous quantities of animal bones. Schmidt's team, working with zoo archaeologist Joris Peters, catalogued bones from gazelle, wild sheep, wild cattle, wild boar, and other game animals. The quantity was staggering, representing thousands of animals. Chemical analysis of the bones showed they'd been cooked and consumed. Göbekli Tepe, whatever else it was, had been a place of massive communal feasting on a scale that suggested hundreds or even thousands of people gathering periodically. But there was no evidence of permanent habitation. No houses, no hearths for daily cooking, no storage facilities, no middens of everyday trash. The bones were all from wild animals, no domesticated species. The flint tools were designed for hunting and butchering, not for agriculture. Everything about the site suggested it was not lived in continuously, but was instead visited periodically, perhaps seasonally, by mobile groups who came together for ritual purposes, for ceremonies and feasting, and the construction and maintenance of these extraordinary stone circles. The implications were staggering. These enclosures had been built by people who still lived as their ancestors had lived for tens of thousands of years, moving with the seasons, following game herds, gathering wild plants. They hadn't yet domesticated wheat or barley. They hadn't yet bred sheep or cattle. They hadn't invented pottery for storing grain. They were by every conventional measure Stone Age hunters. Yet they had created this. They had organised labour forces of hundreds to quarry stones weighing many tons. They had transported these stones from quarries located at the edges of the tell, dragging them hundreds of metres across uneven ground. They had erected them with precision. They had carved them with artistry and skill that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. They had maintained these structures, kept them clear of debris, returned to them again and again across generations. The radiocarbon dating results were what truly stunned the world. Organic material retrieved from the earliest layers of construction, charcoal and bone fragments embedded in the mortar and fill, consistently return dates to approximately 9600 to 9500 BCE for the oldest enclosures like Enclosure D. Some of the later structures, smaller and less elaborate, dated to around 8000 BCE. The site had been in use for at least 1500 years, possibly longer. Let those numbers sink in for a moment. 9600 BCE. That's 11,600 years ago from our present moment. To put that in perspective, imagine standing in 9600 BC and looking back in time, the same distance we're looking back at Göbekli Tepe. You'd be looking at a point around 18,000 BCE, deep in the last ice age, when massive ice sheets covered much of Europe and North America, when woolly mammoths still roamed the northern steppes, when the very map of the world was different, with sea levels more than 100 metres lower than today. This meant Göbekli Tepe was not merely old, it was ancient beyond precedent. It predated Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years. It predated the Great Pyramids of Giza by more than 7,000 years. It predated the earliest Sumerian cities, Ur and Uruk and Eridu, the ones that gave birth to writing and mathematics and organised religion as we understand them by nearly 5,000 years. It was built at a time when, according to everything archaeologists thought they knew, humans were supposed to be living in small nomadic bands of perhaps 20 to 50 individuals following game animals across seasonal ranges, with no permanent settlements, no complex social hierarchies, and no ability to organise large-scale construction projects. Yet here was Göbekli Tepe, a complex that required coordination of hundreds of workers, sophisticated knowledge of stone quarrying and transport, understanding of structural engineering, mastery of artistic techniques, and a shared symbolic system elaborate enough for sustained construction and ritual use over dozens of generations spanning more than a millennium. The implications were staggering. As Schmidt himself famously wrote, it seemed that at Göbekli Tepe, the temple came before the city. Religion, or at least organised ritual practice, appeared to have preceded agriculture, settlement, and all the other markers of what we call civilization. This wasn't just a revision of dates. It was a fundamental challenge to the model of human development that had dominated archaeology since its inception. The standard narrative went like this. First came agriculture, the domestication of plants and animals, which allowed people to produce surplus food and settle in permanent villages. Settlement created the conditions for specialization. Some people could focus on farming while others became craftspeople or priests or administrators. Specialization led to social hierarchy and complex religious practices, which eventually required permanent ritual structures, temples. Temples came after cities as the crown jewel of civilized life. Göbekli Tepe reversed the entire sequence. Here was a massive ritual center, multiple monumental temples built by people who still hunted and gathered for their food. The temple came first. Schmidt proposed that the regular gatherings required to build and maintain Göbekli Tepe, the organisation and cooperation necessary for such a project, actually helped drive the development of agriculture. When hundreds of people gathered periodically in one place, they needed to be fed. The wild resources of the immediate area would quickly be depleted, so there would have been pressure to cultivate plants to ensure a reliable food supply for these gathering events. Religion in this model didn't emerge from settled agricultural civilization. It helped create it. But it wasn't just their size that was remarkable. The pillars were decorated, carved with intricate bas-reliefs of animals in aggressive, dynamic poses. Schmidt's team catalogued foxes with teeth bared, wild boars charging, cranes and ducks in flight, serpents coiled and ready to strike, scorpions with stingers raised, lions prowling, and vultures with wings spread wide. The carvings weren't crude or primitive. They showed sophisticated understanding of anatomy, movement, and artistic composition. Some pillars also bore abstract symbols, H-shapes, crescents, circles, and repeated geometric patterns whose meanings remain unknown. Most intriguing of all, many of the central pillars showed anthropomorphic features. Carved in low relief on their sides were arms bent at the elbow, hands positioned at what would be the belly, and what appeared to be items of clothing, belts, and loincloths. The T-shape itself, Schmidt realized, was not arbitrary. The horizontal top represented a head seen in profile, the vertical shaft a body. These weren't just pillars, they were abstract representations of human beings, perhaps ancestors, perhaps something more. The radiocarbon dating results were what truly stunned the world. Organic material retrieved from the earliest layers of construction, charcoal and bone fragments embedded in the mortar and fill consistently returned dates to approximately 9600 to 9500 BCE, placing the site's construction at the very end of the Younger Dryas, a period of dramatic climate change that marked the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. This meant Göbekli Tepe was not merely old, it was ancient beyond precedent. It predated Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years. It predated the Great Pyramids of Giza by more than 7,000 years. It predated the earliest Sumerian cities, the ones that gave birth to writing and mathematics and organised religion, by nearly 5,000 years. It was built at a time when, according to everything archaeologists thought they knew, humans were supposed to be living in small nomadic bands, following game animals across seasonal ranges, with no permanent settlements and no ability to organise large-scale construction projects. Yet here was Göbekli Tepe, a complex requiring coordination of hundreds of workers, sophisticated knowledge of stone quarrying and transport, understanding of structural engineering, and a shared symbolic system elaborate enough to sustain construction over multiple generations. The implications were staggering. As Schmidt himself wrote, it seemed that at Göbekli Tepe, the temple came before the city. Religion, or at least organised ritual practice, appeared to have preceded agriculture, settlement, and all the other markers of what we call civilization. Over the following 2 decades, until his death in 2014, Schmidt dedicated his life to excavating and understanding Göbekli Tepe. He worked 2 months in spring and 2 months in fall every year, carefully removing the accumulated earth, documenting every layer, every artifact, every carved stone. By the time of his death, the team had identified more than 20 circular enclosures across the site, though only a handful had been excavated. The largest measured 30 metres in diameter, surrounded by stone walls into which 11 massive pillars were embedded, each one carved with its own unique assemblage of animals and symbols. Schmidt developed a theory about the site's purpose. He saw it not as a settlement but as a sanctuary, a place where nomadic groups from across a wide region would gather for ritual purposes. He found no evidence of permanent habitation, no hearths, no storage facilities, no living quarters. Instead, he found the bones of wild animals in enormous quantities, gazelle, aurochs, wild sheep, suggesting massive feasting events. The animal carvings, he believed, might represent totems of different clans or tribes, each enclosure built and maintained by a specific group as a way of marking their participation in this grand communal project. But Schmidt's interpretation, while widely respected, was not the only one. From the moment the first images of Göbekli Tepe's pillars appeared in archaeological journals and then in popular media, alternative researchers seized on the site as evidence for their own theories about humanity's hidden past. And no theory was more persistent, more elaborate, or more controversial than the idea that Göbekli Tepe was connected to the Anunnaki. To understand this claim, we need to step away from the Turkish highlands for a moment and travel south and east, across the border into Syria and then into Iraq, to the flat alluvial plains where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet. This is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, and it is here, in the ruins of ancient Sumer, that we first encounter the beings called the Anunnaki. The word Anunnaki appears in Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform texts dating back to around 2400 BCE, though the gods themselves were clearly worshipped for centuries before anyone thought to write their names in clay. The term's exact translation is debated, but most scholars agree it means something like princely offspring or those of royal blood, indicating their supreme status in the divine hierarchy. In the earliest texts, the Anunnaki are described as the children of An, the sky god, the remote supreme deity who ruled from the highest heaven but rarely intervened in earthly affairs. The Anunnaki were not a unified group with a single purpose. They were a pantheon, a divine family with complex relationships, rivalries, and shifting allegiances. Different cities in Sumer worshipped different members of this family as their patron deities. But certain names appear again and again in the myths, forming a core group of the most powerful Anunnaki. At the apex stood An, also called Anu, in the Akkadian language that succeeded Sumerian. He was the father of gods, the personification of heaven itself, the ultimate source of divine authority. Yet despite his supreme position, An was curiously passive in most myths. He was the distant patriarch, the origin point, but not the active force shaping events. That role fell to his children. Chief among them was Enlil, whose name means Lord of the Command or Lord of the Wind. Enlil was the executive of the pantheon, the god of air and storms, the enforcer of divine law. His primary cult centre was the city of Nippur, where his temple, the Akur or mountain house, served as a meeting place for the assembly of the gods. In Sumerian cosmology, Enlil was the one who separated heaven from earth at the beginning of creation. He split his father An from his mother Ki, the earth goddess carrying away the earth as his domain while An kept the sky. Enlil was powerful, sometimes wrathful, often stern. The myths describe him as easily angered, particularly by noise and disorder. He demanded respect, obedience, absolute authority. When humans multiplied and their clamour disturbed his rest, it was Enlil who decided to wipe them out with a great flood. But Enlil had a brother, and this brother was his perfect counterbalance. Where Enlil represented order, authority and power, his brother represented wisdom, creativity and cunning. His name was Enki in Sumerian, Ea in Akkadian. The exact etymology of both names is uncertain, but Enki is usually translated as Lord of the Earth, though his actual domain was not the land but the Abzu, the vast ocean of fresh water believed to lie beneath the earth, the source of all springs, rivers and wells. Enki was the god of wisdom, magic, crafts and incantations. He was the clever one, the trickster, the inventor, the one who solved problems through ingenuity rather than force. He was strongly associated with water in all its life-giving properties, and Sumerian texts often make explicit connections between the creative power of his semen and the animating nature of fresh water from the Abzu. He was depicted in art with streams of water flowing from his shoulders, filled with swimming fish, the visible manifestation of his life-giving essence. The relationship between Enlil and Enki is the engine that drives much of Sumerian mythology. They were half-brothers, both sons of An, but by different mothers, and their dynamic was one of constant tension and occasional conflict. Enlil was the commander, the king, but Enki was the one with the knowledge, the one who understood the deepest mysteries of creation. Time and again in the myths, when Enlil decreed something in his absolute authority, it was Enki who found a way around it, who subverted the decree through cleverness, who protected those whom Enlil sought to destroy. This pattern appears most famously in the story of the Great Flood, preserved in multiple Mesopotamian texts including the Atrahasis epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh. The story goes that humanity had multiplied across the earth, and their noise, their constant activity and clamour, disturbed the sleep of Enlil. After enduring this irritation for generations, Enlil convened the Council of the Gods and proposed a solution. He would send a flood, a deluge so vast it would wipe out every living thing on earth, returning the world to silence. The other gods agreed, swearing a solemn oath to keep the plan secret from mortals. But Enki, who had played a role in creating humanity, who felt something like affection for his creation, could not allow the total extinction of the human race. Yet he was bound by his oath. He could not tell any human directly about the coming catastrophe. So he found a loophole. He went to the reed hut of a righteous man named Utnapishtim, in the Sumerian version, Atrahasis, in the earlier Akkadian account. But Enki did not speak to the man. Instead, he spoke to the wall of the hut, ostensibly addressing the reeds themselves. Reed wall, he said, loud enough for the man inside to hear. Tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon your possessions and save your life. He gave the wall detailed instructions for the dimensions of the vessel, told it to seal every seam with bitumen, and told it to bring aboard the man's family and the seed of all living things. Utnapishtim, listening from inside, understood. He built the boat exactly as instructed. When the flood came, unleashed by Enlil with such violence that even the gods themselves cowered in fear at the highest levels of heaven, Utnapishtim and his family rowed it out safely in their sealed vessel. For 6 days and 7 nights the storm raged, until all of humanity had been reduced to clay, all the cities swept away, all the land flattened. Finally, the waters receded. The boat came to rest on a mountain top. Utnapishtim sent out a dove, which returned. He sent out a swallow, which returned. He sent out a raven, which found food and did not return. The world was emerging again from the waters. Utnapishtim made a sacrifice to the gods, and the gods, who had been without offerings for a week, gathered like flies around the smoke. When Enlil arrived and saw the boat, saw that humans had survived, he was furious. Someone had betrayed the oath. Enki was forced to confess, but he argued eloquently. Instead of indiscriminate slaughter, he said, there were better ways to control human population. Famines, wild animals, plagues, these could keep numbers in check without total annihilation. Enlil, persuaded by the argument and perhaps exhausted by his own rage, relented. Humanity would be allowed to continue. This dynamic between the two brothers, Enlil's harsh authority and Enki's protective cunning, became the template for understanding the relationship between humanity and the divine in Mesopotamian thought. But it also became something else. When alternative researchers in the 20th century began reinterpreting these myths, looking for evidence of ancient astronauts, they saw in Enlil and Enki not gods but extraterrestrial beings, alien visitors engaged in a long-running conflict over what to do with their genetic creation, humanity itself. The man most responsible for popularizing this interpretation was Zechariah Sitchin, an Azerbaijani-born author and self-taught scholar of ancient languages. In 1996, Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet, the first in a series that would eventually span 14 volumes under the collective title The Earth Chronicles. In these books, Sitchin presented a radical reinterpretation of Sumerian mythology. He argued that the Anunnaki were not gods at all but flesh and blood extraterrestrial beings from a planet he called Nibiru, which he claimed was part of our solar system, but on a vast elliptical orbit taking 3,600 Earth years to complete. According to Sitchin's translation of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, the Anunnaki came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago. Their home planet, Nibiru, was dying, its atmosphere was eroding, and the only way to save it was to suspend fine particles of gold in the upper atmosphere to create a reflective shield. Nibiru was poor in gold, but Earth was rich with it. So the Anunnaki launched a mining expedition, establishing their first base at the site that would become the Sumerian city of Eridu, and beginning extraction operations primarily in what is now southeastern Africa. For thousands of years, the Anunnaki mined the gold themselves, but the work was brutal. The rank-and-file workers, called the Agigi in the texts, eventually mutinied, burning their tools and surrounding the house of Enlil, demanding relief. The Anunnaki leadership faced a crisis. They needed the gold, but they could no longer extract it themselves. This is where Enki stepped forward with a proposal. Instead of punishing the rebels, he suggested creating a new being, a primitive worker species genetically engineered from the native hominids that already existed on Earth. Using advanced knowledge of genetics, Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag took a creature that was probably Homo erectus and upgraded it, infusing its DNA with Anunnaki genetic material. The result was Homo sapiens, modern humanity created not through millions of years of evolution, but through deliberate intervention, designed specifically to be intelligent enough to follow orders, but not intelligent enough to question them. We were, in Sitchin's telling, a slave species from the very beginning. The biblical story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Sitchin argued, was a distorted cultural memory of this genetic engineering project. The garden was a laboratory. The forbidden fruit was the gift of knowledge that Enki, acting against the wishes of Enlil, gave to his creation, allowing humanity to develop independent thought and free will. The expulsion from Eden was humanity being deployed to the mines to begin their intended work. Sitchin's theories were roundly rejected by mainstream academics. Professional Assyriologists and linguists examined his translations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts and found them deeply flawed. He was accused of cherry-picking words, ignoring context, imposing modern concepts onto ancient spiritual texts, and essentially fabricating connections that the source material did not support. The academic consensus remains that the Anunnaki were simply the primary deities of the Mesopotamian pantheon, gods in the traditional sense, representations of natural forces and cosmic principles, not extraterrestrial miners. Yet despite this rejection, or perhaps because of it, Sitchin's ideas found an enormous popular audience. His book sold millions of copies and spawned an entire subculture of ancient astronaut theorists. His interpretation of the Anunnaki became a staple of alternative history documentaries and played a central role in television series like Ancient Aliens. For many people dissatisfied with conventional explanations of human origins, frustrated by what they saw as the arrogance of mainstream science, Sitchin's narrative offered something compelling. A grand, unified theory that connected ancient texts, archaeological anomalies and modern genetics into a single coherent story. Which brings us back to Göbekli Tepe. When Klaus Schmidt announced his discovery of a massive temple complex built by hunter-gatherers 12,000 years ago, alternative researchers immediately saw connections to Sitchin's timeline. According to Sitchin, the Great Flood occurred around 13,000 years ago, triggered by the gravitational effects of Nibiru's passage through the inner solar system. The flood was Enlil's attempt to wipe out humanity, and only Enki's intervention saved a remnant. After the waters receded, the Anunnaki supposedly helped the survivors rebuild, teaching them agriculture, animal husbandry, astronomy, and the other foundations of civilization. In this framework, Göbekli Tepe suddenly makes perfect sense. It was built immediately after the flood, at precisely the time when the Anunnaki would have been most active on Earth, transferring their knowledge to the surviving humans. Its sophistication, so impossible for Stone Age hunters, becomes explicable if the builders had help, guidance, perhaps even direct participation from beings with advanced technology. The site's apparent lack of practical purpose, its focus on ritual and symbol, fits the pattern of a temple, a place where humans could commune with their creators, where the Anunnaki could be worshipped as the gods they had become in human memory. Some researchers go further. They point to the T-shaped pillars with their carved arms and hands, and suggest these are not abstract representations of humans, but literal portraits of the Anunnaki themselves, tall beings with elongated heads and features distinct from our own. They note the aggressive, predatory animals carved on the pillars, scorpions, snakes, vultures, predators, and suggest these might represent the violent nature of the Anunnaki or warnings about the dangers of defying them. They examine the abstract symbols, the H-shapes and crescents and handbag-like glyphs, and argue these are writing, an early form of communication predating Sumerian cuneiform by thousands of years, perhaps the language of the Anunnaki themselves. The most dramatic claim involves Pillar 43, the so-called Vulture Stone. In 2017, two researchers from the University of Edinburgh, Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsakritsis, published a paper arguing that the carvings on this pillar were not random decorations but a precise astronomical date stamp, a memorial to a catastrophic comet impact that triggered the Younger Dryas climate event around 1050 BCE. They interpreted the animals as constellations, the scorpion as Scorpio, the vulture as Sagittarius, and the circular shape above the vulture's wing as the sun. By calculating when these constellations would have been aligned exactly as shown on the pillar, they arrived at a date that matched almost perfectly with the proposed timing of a comet strike. Their theory suggested Göbekli Tepe was not just a temple, but an observatory, a place where ancient peoples watched the skies and recorded celestial catastrophes. The headless human figure at the base of Pillar 43 represented the mass death and destruction caused by the impact. The entire site was a warning across time, a message from survivors of global catastrophe to future generations, telling them what had happened and urging them never to forget. This interpretation has been vigorously disputed by the archaeological team working at Göbekli Tepe. They point out numerous problems with the astronomical theory. The dating doesn't match the radiocarbon evidence from the enclosure itself, which is several hundred years younger than the proposed impact. The assumption that Neolithic people saw the same constellations as later cultures is unwarranted, and crucially, Sweatman and Tsakritsis ignored significant details of the pillar, including the fact that the supposedly lifeless headless human also has a very prominent erect phallus, hardly suggesting death and extinction, and that there are additional carvings on the narrow sides of the pillar that don't fit the astronomical interpretation at all. Yet for ancient astronaut proponents, the comet theory actually strengthens the Anunnaki connection. If a catastrophic impact did occur around 11,000 BCE, causing the Younger Dryas and nearly wiping out humanity, then the timing aligns perfectly with the flood myths preserved in Sumerian texts. Perhaps the Anunnaki knew the impact was coming. Perhaps they warned a chosen few, like Utnapishtim, to prepare. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was built after the catastrophe as a memorial. Yes, but also as a temple to honour the beings who had saved humanity from total extinction, the Anunnaki gods who descended from the heavens just when all seemed lost. There is another layer to consider. Göbekli Tepe is not unique. Since its discovery, archaeologists have identified numerous other sites in the same region of southeastern Turkey with similar T-shaped pillars and circular enclosures, places like Karahan Tepe, Habet Suvan Tepesi, and Taşlı Tepe. Some researchers refer to this emerging pattern as the Taş Tepe culture, the Stonehill culture, suggesting a shared symbolic system spread across a wide geographic area during the pre-pottery Neolithic. This expansion of the Göbekli phenomenon has led to new speculations. Perhaps this wasn't just one temple, but a network of sacred sites, all built according to the same divine blueprint, all serving as contact points between humans and the Anunnaki. The Sumerian texts speak of the Anunnaki establishing multiple cities in Mesopotamia, Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, each with Thanid's own temple complex. What if the Taş Tepe sites were the precursors to these later Sumerian cities? The original temples built when the Anunnaki first arrived, or immediately after the flood, before humans had fully developed the agricultural civilizations that would create Sumer. Klaus Schmidt himself, interestingly, touched on themes that resonate with this speculation, though he approached them from a very different angle. In a 2011 interview, Schmidt suggested that Göbekli Tepe might preserve a partial memory of the Neolithic Revolution. He pointed to an ancient Sumerian belief that agriculture, animal husbandry, and weaving were brought to humans from a sacred mountain called Ekur, inhabited by very ancient deities called the Anuna, which is simply another name for the Anunnaki. Schmidt saw this as a primordial myth, a cultural memory of the transition to farming preserved in religious form. But consider what Schmidt was saying. He acknowledged that Sumerian texts connected the Anunnaki specifically to the transfer of civilization, the giving of agricultural knowledge and technology to humanity, and he acknowledged that these texts referred to a sacred mountain. Göbekli Tepe sits on a mountain. It was built at precisely the time when agriculture was beginning in the Fertile Crescent. If we take the Sumerian texts even halfway seriously, not as literal truth, but as preserving genuine historical memory in mythological form, then the connection between Göbekli Tepe and the Anunnaki becomes hard to dismiss entirely. Here we encounter the central tension in all ancient astronaut theories. Mainstream archaeology has a perfectly coherent explanation for Göbekli Tepe. It was built by highly intelligent, resourceful hunter-gatherers who were in the process of transitioning to settled agriculture. The sophistication of the site doesn't require alien intervention, just a willingness to revise our assumptions about what pre-agricultural societies were capable of. The circular enclosures probably served ritual purposes, perhaps as gathering places for different clans, perhaps as ceremonial centres where shamanistic practices were performed. The animal carvings represented the spiritual worldview of these people, their relationship with the natural world, their totems and symbols of identity. The apparent lack of habitation at the site simply means it wasn't lived in permanently but was visited periodically for festivals and rituals. This explanation is elegant, evidence-based, and doesn't require any extraordinary assumptions. It pushes back the timeline of human achievement significantly, yes, but it keeps everything within the realm of purely human development, slow, incremental, building on accumulated knowledge over generations. The Anunnaki theory, by contrast, requires accepting several extraordinary claims. It requires believing that extraterrestrial beings visited Earth not just once, but repeatedly over hundreds of thousands of years. It requires believing they genetically engineered our species. It requires believing they left enough of an impression that memories of them persisted for thousands of years in mythological form. It requires believing that a site built 12,000 years ago by people with stone tools was actually influenced by or dedicated to these beings. And it requires believing that mainstream archaeology is either wrong about fundamental aspects of human prehistory or is engaged in a deliberate cover-up of the truth. Yet here is what cannot be easily dismissed. The myths themselves are real. The Sumerian texts genuinely do describe beings called Anunnaki who came from the sky, who created humans as workers, who established cities and taught crafts and agriculture. These are not modern inventions, they are ancient stories, carefully preserved on clay tablets, part of the world's earliest written literature. Whether we interpret them as mythology, cultural memory, or historical record is a choice, but the texts exist. They say what they say, and Göbekli Tepe is real. Its existence contradicts decades of archaeological assumptions about the development of civilization. Its builders possessed knowledge and organizational capacity that should not have existed at that time in human history. The site appeared suddenly, with no visible precursors, fully formed in its sophistication. And after 1,000 years of use, it was deliberately buried, filled in with rubble and soil, hidden from view until Klaus Schmidt unearthed it 11,000 years later. Why was it buried? Who made that decision? What were they trying to preserve or protect or conceal? The most honest answer to the question of whether Göbekli Tepe was an Anunnaki temple is that we don't know. We don't know who built it, not really. We don't know why they built it, not with certainty. We don't know what the symbols mean or what rituals were performed there or what beliefs animated the people who moved those massive stones. The academic explanations are well-reasoned but ultimately speculative. The ancient astronaut explanations are creative but impossible to prove. What we're left with is mystery. Genuine mystery, the kind that doesn't resolve neatly no matter how much evidence we accumulate. Standing among those pillars, if you could somehow travel back to that Turkish hilltop at night 12,000 years ago, you would see the same stars those builders saw. You would feel the same wind moving across the stone, but you would not understand. The gap between their world and ours is too vast. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Göbekli Tepe. It reminds us how little we actually know about our own past, how fragmentary the record is, how much has been lost. Every civilization leaves ruins, but mostly very little else. The thoughts, beliefs, fears, and dreams of our ancestors are gone, dissolved in time. All we have are the stones they moved, the art they made, the bones they left behind. From these fragments, we construct stories, trying to bridge that impossible gap. Some of those stories are more grounded than others. Some require less imagination, fewer leaps of faith. But all of them, including the most conservative academic interpretations, are acts of imagination in the end. We're all looking at the same stones, the same carvings, the same empty circles of pillars standing on a windswept hill, and we're all trying to understand what they meant to the people who made them. The Anunnaki theory is one of those stories. It's a story that says we are not alone, that we never were, that our origins are stranger and more complex than we've been told. It's a story that looks at the impossible sophistication of Göbekli Tepe and says, this makes sense if they had help, if beings with knowledge beyond their own time guided them, taught them, perhaps even built alongside them. It's a story that takes ancient texts seriously, that refuses to dismiss them as mere primitive superstition, that asks what if they remembered something real, even if they described it in the only language they had, the language of gods and miracles. Is it true? The evidence is circumstantial, open to interpretation, dependent on how you read ambiguous texts and how much weight you give to anomalous archaeological finds. Mainstream scholars will tell you no, it's not true, it's a modern myth imposed on ancient ruins, a product of wishful thinking and misunderstanding. And they may be right. Probably they are right. But standing on that hilltop, looking at those pillars carved by hands that should not have been capable of such work, it's hard not to wonder. It's hard not to feel the pull of the mystery, hard not to imagine just for a moment that maybe, just maybe, those old stories preserved something more than myth. The night is quiet now. The stones of Göbekli Tepe are still there, patient, waiting, as they've waited for 12,000 years. The questions they raise won't be answered tonight, might never be answered. And perhaps that's how it should be. Some mysteries are meant to endure, not because we lack the tools to solve them, but because they remind us that the world is wider and stranger than we know, that history is deeper than we imagine, that the line between the possible and the impossible is drawn in sand, not stone. Close your eyes if they're not closed already. Let the story settle. Let the images fade, the Turkish highlands, the carved pillars, the ancient gods or aliens or memories, whatever they were. Let it all drift away like smoke from a fire that burned out millennia ago. If this journey has stayed with you, if these ancient mysteries have touched something in your thoughts, a gentle like helps others find their way here. Consider subscribing if you'd like more of these explorations, more nights spent wandering through the shadows of the past. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think really happened at Göbekli Tepe? Were the Anunnaki gods, aliens, or myths? There are no wrong answers, only different ways of looking at the same eternal questions. Other ancient worlds await in the playlist whenever you're ready to continue exploring. The stones are always there, patient, holding their secrets close. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well and dream deep. Good night. Over the following 2 decades, until his sudden death from a heart attack while swimming in July 2014, Klaus Schmidt dedicated his life to excavating and understanding Göbekli Tepe. He worked 2 months in spring and 2 months in fall every year, carefully removing the accumulated earth, documenting every layer, every artifact, every carved stomud. He purchased a house in nearby Schänlöfe, making it his base of operations, becoming part of the local community. The site became his life's work, his obsession, his legacy. By the time of his death, Schmidt estimated that roughly 5 to 10% of the site had been excavated. The geophysical surveys showed anomalies, magnetic signatures consistent with buried structures, scattered across the entire 8-hectare TL. There might be 100 enclosures buried there, 1,000 pillars. Secrets enough to occupy archaeologists for centuries. Schmidt would never see most of it unearthed. But he'd done enough. He'd revealed to the world that everything we thought we knew about the origins of civilization needed to be reconsidered. His funeral was attended by hundreds Turkish officials and German colleagues, local villagers who had worked on the excavation and international scholars who'd been inspired by his work. They buried him not in Germany but in the region he'd made his home, the land of Göbekli Tepe. His widow, fellow archaeologist Chidem Köksal Schmidt, and his colleagues vowed to continue his work, to protect the site, to keep searching for answers to the questions he'd raised. One of the most haunting aspects of Göbekli Tepe is what happened to it. Around 8000 BCE, after more than 1500 years of use, the site was deliberately buried. This wasn't gradual abandonment, the slow accumulation of windblown soil and decomposing vegetation. This was intentional decommissioning. Some group made the decision to fill in the enclosures with rubble and soil, to cover the pillars to hide the site from view. The archaeological evidence is unambiguous. The fill dirt contains thousands of stone tools, animal bones, broken pottery from later periods that somehow made its way into the backfill, all deliberately dumped. Why? Why would people invest so much effort in burying something they or their ancestors had worked so hard to create? Schmidt proposed that the intentional burial was itself a ritual act, a way of preserving the sanctity of the site. By burying it, they transformed it from a functioning temple into a sacred mound, a holy hill that would remain undisturbed. But others wonder if there was a darker reason. Was something being hidden? Was there a schism, a religious revolution that required the old temples to be not just abandoned but entombed? The deliberate burial had the effect of preserving Göbekli Tepe in remarkable condition. While other Neolithic sites eroded away, scattered by wind and rain, crushed by centuries of agricultural activity, Göbekli Tepe remained sealed, protected by the very soil that concealed it. The pillars that Schmidt's team excavated emerged from the earth in nearly pristine condition, their carvings as sharp as the day they were made, protected by the darkness and pressure of the fill. Now we need to step back and consider the world in which Göbekli Tepe was built. The period around 9600 BCE was not an ordinary time. It marked the end of one of the most dramatic and mysterious climate events in recent Earth history, a period called the Younger Dryas. To understand the significance of this, to grasp why it matters to both mainstream archaeology and alternative theories, we need to journey backward another few thousand years to around 13,000 BCE. For nearly 100,000 years, Earth had been locked in an ice age. Massive glaciers, kilometres thick, covered much of North America, Europe and Asia. Sea levels were more than 100 metres lower than today because so much water was frozen in these continental ice sheets. The global climate was harsh, cold, dry, with vast regions of the planet essentially uninhabitable. Human populations were small, scattered, living in the few regions where conditions were tolerable. Then, around 14 to 700 years ago, the world began to warm. The ice started to melt. This period, called the Boiling Allereux Interstadial, saw temperatures rise rapidly in geological terms, perhaps 5 to 10 degrees Celsius in just a few centuries. Glaciers retreated. Vegetation spread northward. Sea levels began to rise. It seemed like the planet was transitioning steadily into a warmer, more hospitable climate, the climate that would eventually become our modern world. But then, around 12 to 900 years ago, something happened. The warming stopped. The climate reversed course dramatically. Temperatures plummeted, in some regions dropping as much as 15 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. The glaciers that had been retreating began to advance again. Drought gripped many regions. The climate became unstable, violent, unpredictable. This cold snap, this return to near glacial conditions, lasted for roughly 1,200 years, from about 12 to 900 to 11,700 years ago. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. Temperatures shot up again. The glaciers made their final retreat in the Holocene. Our current warm period began. This climate event, the Younger Dryas, is named after a cold-adapted flowering plant called Dryas octopetala, whose pollen appears in abundance in sediment cores from this period. For decades, its cause was one of geology's great mysteries. The mainstream explanation involved ocean currents. The melting of the glaciers released enormous quantities of fresh water into the North Atlantic. This fresh water, being less dense than salt water, formed a layer on the ocean's surface that disrupted the thermohaline circulation, the global ocean conveyor belt that transports warm water from the tropics northward. When this circulation shut down or weakened, the result was rapid cooling in the northern hemisphere. This explanation is scientifically sound and well supported by evidence, but in recent decades an alternative and more dramatic theory has gained traction among some researchers. This is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and it suggests that the climate reversal was triggered not by ocean current changes alone, but by a catastrophic cosmic impact, a comet or swarm of comet fragments striking Earth with devastating effect. The evidence for this theory is complex and hotly debated. Proponents point to a distinct layer in the geological record marking the beginning of the Younger Dryas, a layer that contains unusual materials. High concentrations of platinum group elements, rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. Microscopic diamonds called nanodiamonds that can only form under the extreme temperatures and pressures of an impact. Magnetic spherules, tiny balls of melted rock, charcoal layers indicating massive widespread fires, and in sediment cores from sites across North America, Europe and Asia, a consistent pattern, a sudden spike in these impact markers precisely at the boundary where the Younger Dryas began. If a comet did strike, it likely didn't hit as a single large object. Instead, the comet probably disintegrated in Earth's atmosphere or just before impact, creating an airburst or multiple airbursts, similar to the Tunguska event in Siberia in 2008, but on a vastly larger scale. The explosions would have released energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons. Forests across the northern hemisphere would have ignited instantly. The heat and blast waves would have melted portions of the Laurentide ice sheet covering North America, releasing catastrophic floods. The debris thrown into the atmosphere would have blocked sunlight, triggering rapid cooling. The ecological devastation would have been immense. Critics of the impact hypothesis argue that the evidence is ambiguous, that alternative explanations exist for each of the proposed impact markers, that the case hasn't been proven beyond reasonable doubt. The debate continues in academic journals, with papers published on both sides, evidence marshalled and contested. What's not debatable is that something dramatic happened around 12,900 years ago. The climate changed rapidly and violently. Megafauna species that had survived for tens of thousands of years went extinct within centuries, and human cultures across the northern hemisphere were disrupted, forced to adapt to sudden environmental catastrophe. This is the context in which Göbekli Tepe was built. Whether triggered by impact or ocean currents or some combination of factors, the Younger Dryas was a period of immense hardship. Then, around 9600 BCE, the cold suddenly lifted, temperatures rose, and the modern world began. It was in this moment of transition, this emergence from catastrophe into a new age, that the hunters of southeastern Anatolia gathered on that potbelly hill and began to quarry and carve massive stones, creating circles of pillars that would stand for thousands of years. The timing is striking. Too striking, some researchers argue, to be mere coincidence. This brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of Göbekli Tepe, the interpretation of its most famous pillar. Pillar 43, located in Enclosure D, has become known popularly as the Vulture Stone. It's not the largest pillar at the site, nor even the most intricately carved, but it's become the most analysed, the most debated, the most laden with competing interpretations. The pillar is a wall pillar, embedded in the northern section of Enclosure D's circular wall immediately adjacent to one of the site's distinctive porthole stones, carved limestone slabs with circular holes cut through them, whose purpose remains unknown. The surface of Pillar 43 is covered with carvings. At the base is the figure of a headless human, or at least a figure that appears headless, its shoulders squared, but no indication of a head above them. The figure's anatomy is clearly male, with an erect phallus prominently displayed. Above this headless figure, the pillar's surface is filled with animals. At the centre is a large bird with wings spread wide, interpreted by some as a vulture, by others as an eagle or other large raptor. The bird's posture is distinctive, one wing raised nearly vertical, the other held horizontal, creating an asymmetric composition that draws the eye. Above the bird's right wing is a circular shape, a disc that stands out from the surrounding carvings. Below the bird is a clear depiction of a scorpion, its segmented body and raised tail unmistakable. Scattered around these central images are other animals, what might be an ibex or gazelle, additional birds, a snake, and several creatures whose exact identification remains uncertain. At the top of the pillar, along the horizontal surface that represents the head of the anthropomorphic T-shape, is a row of symbols that look like handbags, rectangular shapes with curved tops, repeated multiple times in a frieze. For decades, archaeologists interpreted these carvings as typical Neolithic symbolic art, animals chosen for their spiritual or totemic significance, arranged in a composition whose meaning was specific to the belief system of the builders, but fundamentally unknowable to us. The headless figure was understood in the context of pre-pottery Neolithic mortuary practices, which often involved the removal and separate treatment of the skull. The prominent phallus suggested themes of fertility, regeneration, life force, contradicting any simple interpretation of the figure as representing death. Then, in 2017, everything changed. Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsakritsis, researchers at the University of Edinburgh with backgrounds in chemical engineering and bioengineering rather than archaeology, published a paper in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry. Their claim was extraordinary. They argued that Pillar 43 was not symbolic art, but a precise astronomical date stamp, memorial to a specific celestial event. the comet impact that triggered the Younger Dryas. Their method was to interpret the animals on the pillar as constellations. The scorpion represented Scorpius, the vulture represented Sagittarius, or more specifically, the asterism known as the teapot within Sagittarius. The circular disc above the vulture's wing represented the sun. By using astronomical software to calculate when the sun would have been positioned within Sagittarius precisely as shown on the pillar, matching the positions of the other constellations represented by the carved animals, they arrived at a date 10,950 BCE, plus or minus 250 years. This date, they noted, aligned remarkably well with the proposed timing of the Younger Dryas impact, 12 to 900 years ago. The difference between the astronomical date and the impact date could be explained by precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the positions of stars and constellations to shift over millennia. What Pillar 43 showed, according to Sweatman and Sakritsis, was the sky as it appeared on the day of the catastrophe, a memorial carved by survivors or their descendants, documenting the moment when fire fell from the heavens and the world changed forever. The headless figure at the base, they suggested, represented mass death, extinction, the catastrophic loss of life caused by the impact. The entire enclosure, and by extension the entire site of Göbekli Tepe, was reinterpreted as an observatory and memorial, a place where ancient peoples watched the skies obsessively, tracking meteor showers, recording cometary encounters, trying to understand and perhaps predict the celestial violence that had nearly annihilated their world. The theory exploded into popular consciousness. It was covered by mainstream science media, featured in documentaries, discussed on podcasts. It seemed to bridge the gap between hard science and ancient mystery, using modern astronomical calculations to decode Stone Age symbols. Here was proof, proponents argued, that our ancestors were not primitive. They were sophisticated observers of the cosmos who understood enough about celestial mechanics to record a specific configuration of stars and sun on a specific date more than 12,000 years ago. But the archaeological team at Göbekli Tepe pushed back hard. In a detailed rebuttal published in the same journal, site director Jens Nottroff and his colleagues systematically challenged nearly every aspect of Sweatman and Sakritsis' interpretation. They pointed out that the chronology didn't work. The radiocarbon dates for Enclosure D placed its construction around 9500 BCE, not 10,050 BCE, 700 to 1,000 years after the proposed impact date. How could the builders memorialize an event that occurred more than a millennium before they lived? They noted that Sweatman and Sakritsis had cherry-picked which animals to interpret as constellations, while ignoring others that didn't fit their astronomical model. The pillar contains more animals than just the ones included in the date stamp calculation. Why were some significant and others decorative? The rebuttal also pointed out that the headless figure with the erect phallus is difficult to interpret as representing death and extinction when its most prominent feature is a symbol of life and fertility. And crucially, Sweatman and Sakritsis had apparently not noticed that Pillar 43 has carvings on all four sides, not just the main western face. The sides contain additional animals and symbols that complicate any simple astronomical reading. The fundamental problem, the Göbekli team argued, was that we have no evidence that Neolithic people in southeastern Anatolia recognized the same constellation patterns that we do today. Our modern constellations were defined by Greek, Roman, and earlier Near Eastern astronomers thousands of years after Göbekli Tepe was built. The assumption that a scorpion shape in the sky meant Scorpius to the builders of Göbekli Tepe is just that, an assumption unsupported by any direct evidence. There's a deeper issue too. Pre-pottery Neolithic art is remarkably consistent across sites in this region and period. The same themes appear again and again: headless human figures, birds of prey, disarticulated bodies, skulls treated separately from skeletons. This isn't unique to Göbekli Tepe. It's part of a widespread symbolic system related to complex mortuary practices, to beliefs about death, transformation, and possibly ancestor veneration. To pull one pillar out of this context and give it an entirely different interpretation strains credibility. Yet the astronomical theory persists. Sweatman has continued to publish papers refining the hypothesis, arguing that additional pillars at Göbekli Tepe also contain astronomical information, that the site functioned as a Neolithic observatory tracking the sun, moon, and constellations, recording celestial cycles. Graham Hancock, the popular alternative history author, has incorporated the vulture stone theory into his books and Netflix series, using it as evidence for his larger thesis about a lost civilization destroyed by cosmic catastrophe. For many in the alternative research community, the debate is settled. Pillar 43 is a warning from the past, proof that advanced astronomical knowledge existed far earlier than orthodox archaeology acknowledges. The truth, almost certainly, lies somewhere more complicated than either camp admits. It's possible that the builders of Göbekli Tepe watched the skies carefully, that they noticed patterns in star movements and incorporated some of that knowledge into their symbolic system, without being the sophisticated astronomical calculators that Sweatman proposes. It's possible that the Younger Dryas catastrophe, whether caused by impact or climate shift, left deep scars in the cultural memory of the region, scars that influenced the decision to build Göbekli Tepe without the builders having precise knowledge of dates and celestial configurations. It's possible that we're looking at multi-layered symbolism, where animals mean different things in different contexts, where a scorpion might be both a totemic creature and a celestial marker, where meanings stack and overlap in ways our modern analytical minds struggle to grasp. What cannot be disputed is that something happened in the right time frame. The Younger Dryas was real, the rapid climate change was real, the extinctions were real, the disruption to human cultures was real, and Göbekli Tepe was built in the immediate aftermath by people emerging from catastrophe into a new world. Whether they understood what had caused the catastrophe, whether they recorded it in stone, remains an open question. But the timing connects. The threads, however frayed, link together. And this is where the Anunnaki enter the story. To understand the connection between Göbekli Tepe and the Anunnaki, we need to travel south from Turkey, across the Syrian border and into Iraq, to the flat alluvial plains where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers converge. This is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, and it is here, in the ruins of ancient Sumer, that we first encounter the pantheon of beings whose names have echoed through millennia. The civilization of Sumer emerged around 4500 BCE, more than 4,000 years after Göbekli Tepe was built and buried. The Sumerians invented cuneiform writing, one of the earliest writing systems in human history, pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets. These tablets, once baked hard, have survived for thousands of years, creating an archaeological record of remarkable richness. And preserved on these tablets are the myths, the religious texts, the king lists, and the epic poems that introduce us to the Anunnaki. The word Anunnaki first appears in texts from around 2400 BCE, though the gods themselves were clearly worshipped long before anyone thought to write their names. The translation is debated. Most scholars translate it as something like princely offspring or those of royal blood, indicating supreme divine status. The Anunnaki were the children of An, also called Anu, the remote sky god who ruled from the highest heaven. An was the father of gods, the ultimate source of divine authority, yet curiously passive in most myths. He was the origin point, but rarely the active force shaping events. His children, however, were anything but passive. Chief among them was Enlil, the god of air and wind, whose name means Lord of the Command. Enlil was the administrator of the cosmos, the executor of divine law, powerful and often stern. His cult center was the city of Nippur in central Mesopotamia, where his temple, the Akur, served as the cosmic meeting place for the assembly of gods. In Sumerian creation mythology, it was Enlil who separated heaven from earth at the beginning of time. He split his father An from his mother Ki, the earth goddess, carrying away the earth as his domain while An kept the heavens. Enlil was the strong authority figure, quick to anger, demanding absolute obedience. The myths describe how the noise of human civilization disturbed his rest. As humanity multiplied and spread, their constant activity, their cities and farms and workscapes and markets, created a clamour that rose to the heavens and annoyed Enlil beyond endurance. He tried various solutions, sending drought and famine to reduce human numbers, but nothing worked. Humanity was too resilient, too adaptable. Finally, in frustration, he convinced the Council of Gods to send a flood, a deluge that would wipe the earth clean and restore the silence. But Enlil had a brother who felt differently about humanity. His name was Enki in Sumerian, Ea in the later Akkadian language. Enki was the god of the Abzu, the vast ocean of fresh water believed to lie beneath the earth, source of all springs and rivers. He was the god of wisdom, magic, crafts and incantations. Where Enlil ruled through authority and power, Enki governed through cleverness and knowledge. He was the problem solver, the inventor, the one who found creative solutions to seemingly impossible challenges. The myths portray Enki as having played a central role in the creation of humanity. In the epic known as Atrahasis, the junior gods, called the Agigi, were exhausted from backbreaking labour, digging rivers and building the infrastructure of the divine world. They went on strike, burning their tools and surrounding Enlil's temple, demanding relief. Faced with this crisis, Enki proposed a solution. Instead of punishing the Agigi, create a new being to take over the work, a creature that could labour on behalf of the gods. Working with the mother goddess Ninusag, also called Nintu, or Beletili in various texts, Enki fashioned the first humans. The process described in the Atrahasis myth is specific. They took clay from the Abzu, the primordial waters, and mixed it with divine blood, the blood of a god named We'ela, who was sacrificed for this purpose. This mixture of earthly clay and divine essence gave humanity its dual nature, mortal bodies with a spark of the divine within. 14 birth goddesses served as surrogates, and from their wombs emerged the first humans, 7 males and 7 females, created to be workers, servants of the gods. This is the mythological context. Mainstream scholars interpret these stories as ancient attempts to explain human origins, to provide theological justification for the social order, to answer the fundamental questions all cultures ask. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What is our relationship to the divine? The Sumerians lived in a harsh environment where survival required constant backbreaking labour, intensive irrigation agriculture in the Mesopotamian desert. Their myths reflected their reality, humans as workers, with the gods as the ultimate landlords demanding service and tribute. But in 1976, a man named Zecharia Sitchin published a book that proposed a radically different reading of these same texts. Born in Azerbaijan in 1920, raised in Palestine, educated in economics and history, Sitchin was not a trained archaeologist or linguist in the academic sense. He was self-taught in ancient languages, driven by personal fascination rather than formal credentials, and he brought to the Sumerian texts a perspective that professional scholars had never considered. What if these weren't myths at all? What if they were historical records, literal accounts of real events involving real beings, written in the only language available to ancient scribes, the language of gods and miracles? In The 12th Planet, the first book in his Earth Chronicles series, Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki were not gods, but extraterrestrial visitors, physical beings from a planet he called Nibiru. According to his interpretation of Sumerian astronomical texts, Nibiru was part of our solar system, but on a highly elliptical orbit that took 300 Earth years to complete. For most of its orbit, Nibiru would be in the outer reaches of the solar system, far beyond Pluto, invisible and undetectable. But periodically, every 300-600 years, its orbit would bring it swinging through the inner solar system, passing between Mars and Jupiter. The Anunnaki, Sitchin claimed, came from this planet. Around 450,000 years ago, Nibiru was experiencing an atmospheric crisis. Its protective atmosphere was degrading, threatening all life. The Anunnaki scientists determined that the only way to save their planet was to suspend fine particles of gold in the upper atmosphere, creating a reflective shield that would retain heat and block harmful radiation. The problem was that Nibiru was poor in gold, but Earth, one of the inner planets that Nibiru passed on its orbit, was rich in the precious metal. So the Anunnaki launched an expedition. Under the leadership of Enki, they came to Earth, established a base at what would become the Sumerian city of Eridu, and began mining operations primarily in what is now southeastern Africa. For tens of thousands of years, they extracted gold, shipped it back to Nibiru, and continued their mining. But the work was brutal. The Anunnaki miners, the Igigi, eventually mutinied, just as described in the Atrahasis myth. Faced with this labour crisis, Enki proposed his solution. Using the genetic knowledge the Anunnaki possessed, he would create a hybrid worker species by combining Anunnaki DNA with the DNA of the most advanced hominid then living on Earth, probably Homo erectus. Through what Sitchin described as genetic engineering and in vitro fertilization, the Anunnaki created Homo sapiens, modern humanity, approximately 300,000 years ago. We were, in this telling, designed from the ground up to be intelligent enough to follow complex instructions but not intelligent enough to question our servitude. We were a slave species. Sitchin read the biblical story of Adam and Eve as a distorted memory of this genetic creation. The Garden of Eden was the laboratory or settlement where the first humans were created. The forbidden fruit was the knowledge that Enki, acting against Enlil's wishes, gave to humanity, the awakening of self-awareness and free will. The expulsion from the garden was humanity being deployed to work the mines and farms established by the Anunnaki. The Great Flood, preserved in both Sumerian and biblical texts, occurred according to Sitchin around 13,000 years ago. The Anunnaki knew that the next passage of Nibiru through the solar system would cause gravitational disruptions that would destabilize the Antarctic ice sheet, triggering a global deluge. Enlil saw this as an opportunity to solve the human problem permanently, to let the flood wipe out the noisy, troublesome race the Anunnaki had created. He forced the other Anunnaki to swear an oath of secrecy, forbidding them from warning humans, but Enki couldn't let his creation be destroyed. He found his loophole, speaking to the wall of the reed hut where a man named Sudra, the Sumerian Noah, could overhear, giving instructions to build a submersible vessel and save himself, his family, and the genetic material of Earth's species. When the flood came, Sudra survived. After the waters receded, Enlil reluctantly agreed that humanity could continue, and the Anunnaki began the process of re-establishing civilization, teaching agriculture and animal husbandry to the survivors. This is where Göbekli Tepe enters Sitchin's timeline. Built around 9600 BCE, immediately after the flood in his chronology, the site would represent one of the earliest post-diluvian structures, a temple or gathering place established by the Anunnaki or built by humans under direct Anunnaki guidance. Its sophistication makes sense in this framework because the builders had access to knowledge and possibly technology far beyond what Stone Age humans should have possessed. The site's focus on astronomical observation fits the narrative of a people obsessed with watching for the return of Nibiru, tracking the skies to predict when their creators, or destroyers, would come back. Mainstream scholars reject Sitchin's theories completely. Professional Assyriologists who have dedicated their careers to studying Sumerian and Akkadian languages point out numerous errors in his translations. He consistently mistranslated words, they argue, taking terms out of context, imposing modern concepts onto ancient texts, seeing what he wanted to see rather than what the text actually said. His translation of Anunnaki, as those who from heaven to earth came, is disputed. Most scholars translate it as princely offspring or those of royal blood. His identification of Nibiru as a planet is questioned. The Babylonian astronomical texts that mention Nibiru likely refer to Jupiter or to a specific celestial crossing point, not to an undiscovered planet. The astronomical case against Nibiru is overwhelming. An object large enough to affect Earth's climate, orbiting on a 3,600-year cycle through the inner solar system, would create massive perturbations in the orbits of the known planets. We've mapped the orbits of every planet in our solar system with extraordinary precision. If Nibiru existed, we would see its gravitational influence clearly. We don't. Modern sky surveys have catalogued objects throughout the outer solar system. We've found Pluto, Eris, Makemake, dozens of dwarf planets and trans-Neptunian objects. If Nibiru were out there, especially if it regularly passes through the inner system, we would have found it by now. Geneticists and anthropologists point out that the fossil record shows a clear, gradual evolution of modern humans from earlier hominid species with no evidence of sudden genetic engineering 300,000 years ago. DNA analysis has traced human ancestry back through millions of years, showing our relationship to other primates, demonstrating that we evolved through natural processes over immense periods of time. There's no genetic discontinuity, no sudden insertion of alien DNA. Yet despite this comprehensive academic rejection, Sitchin's ideas have found an enormous audience. His books have sold millions of copies, been translated into dozens of languages, spawned a vast subculture of ancient astronaut enthusiasts. Television series like Ancient Aliens have brought his theories to even wider audiences, presenting them as viable alternatives to mainstream archaeology and history. Why has this happened? Why do these ideas, dismissed by experts, resonate so powerfully with so many people? Part of the answer is that Sitchin offered something conventional science struggles to provide. A grand, unified narrative that makes sense of multiple mysteries at once. He connected ancient texts, archaeological anomalies, myths from diverse cultures, and humanity's rapid technological development into a single coherent story. He gave meaning and purpose to our existence. We're not cosmic accidents, but deliberate creations, designed beings with creators who might one day return. For people dissatisfied with what they perceive as the arrogance and materialism of modern science, this narrative offers an appealing alternative. There's also the undeniable fact that mainstream archaeology has been wrong before, sometimes dramatically so. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe itself is proof of this. For generations, archaeologists insisted that complex monumental architecture could only emerge after agriculture, after settlement, after the development of social hierarchies and specialized labour. Göbekli Tepe proved them wrong. If they were wrong about that, what else might they be wrong about? This opens the door for alternative theories to gain traction, even when those theories lack solid evidential support. And there's a deeper psychological appeal. The ancient astronaut theory makes the past more exciting, more mysterious, more epic than the slow grinding process of conventional archaeology suggests. It's more dramatic to imagine advanced beings descending from the stars to create humanity than to envision gradual evolution driven by natural selection and random mutation. It gives our ancestors credit for being more than we typically assume. If they were in contact with advanced beings, if they possessed knowledge we have lost, then they were special, important participants in a cosmic drama. So when alternative researchers look at Göbekli Tepe, they see not just a Neolithic temple but potential evidence for the Anunnaki. The T-shaped pillars, with their carved arms and hands, might not be abstract human representations but literal portraits of the Anunnaki themselves, tall beings with distinctive features. The sophisticated engineering might indicate direct alien involvement or humans working under alien supervision. The astronomical knowledge suggested by the vulture stone and other carvings might be information provided by beings who understood the cosmos better than Stone Age hunters could possibly have understood it on their own. Some researchers propose that Göbekli Tepe was an Anunnaki outpost or temple, a sacred site where the gods physically descended to meet with their human subjects. The repeated motif of animals, particularly predators, might represent the Anunnaki themselves, powerful, dangerous beings to be feared and respected. The deliberate burial of the site around 8000 BCE might mark the final departure of the Anunnakis, the moment when they withdrew from direct contact with humanity, leaving us to develop on our own. Others suggest a more nuanced connection. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was built by humans, but humans who still had cultural memory of the Anunnaki, humans who were taught by survivors of an earlier, more advanced civilization that had been destroyed in the Younger Dryas catastrophe. In this version, the Anunnaki aren't necessarily extraterrestrials, but could be members of a lost human civilization, advanced enough to seem godlike to later cultures, whose knowledge survived their destruction in the form of myths and teachings passed down through post-cataclysm generations. This bridges toward another major core figure in alternative archaeology, Graham Hancock, whose theories focus less on extraterrestrials and more on a lost advanced human civilization. Hancock proposes that during the last ice age, a sophisticated civilization existed, possibly located in areas now submerged by rising sea levels. This civilization was destroyed by the Younger Dryas catastrophe, probably a comet impact around 12 to 900 years ago. A few survivors scattered across the globe, becoming the culture heroes and gods of later civilizations, teaching astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, and architecture to scattered bands of hunter-gatherers. In Hancock's framework, sites like Göbekli Tepe represent the efforts of these survivors and their immediate descendants to preserve knowledge, to create monuments that would endure, to pass on the wisdom of the lost world. The Anunnaki, in this reading, might have been real people, members of this lost civilization, whose achievements were so impressive to later cultures that they were remembered as gods. Both interpretations, Sitchin's extraterrestrial Anunnaki and Hancock's lost human civilization, share a common thread. They propose that the conventional narrative of human development is incomplete, that something has been lost or hidden, that our ancestors were more capable and knowledgeable than we give them credit for. And both look at Göbekli Tepe and see evidence that the conventional narrative needs revision. The tension here is fundamental. On one side stands mainstream archaeology with its careful methodology, its insistence on evidence and peer review, its incrementalist approach to understanding the past. This approach has produced enormous knowledge, has genuinely revealed the story of human development from our earliest hominid ancestors through the development of modern civilization. It works. It's given us profound insights, but it's also cautious, resistant to dramatic paradigm shifts, sometimes dismissive of anomalies that don't fit established frameworks. On the other side stand the alternative researchers, independent scholars, enthusiasts who look at the same evidence and see patterns that mainstream academia misses or ignores. They are willing to ask wild questions, to propose dramatic theories, to connect dots across vast distances of space and time. Sometimes they're wrong, often spectacularly so. But occasionally, very occasionally, they ask questions that eventually lead to legitimate discoveries. They push boundaries, challenge orthodoxy, keep the conversation from becoming stagnant. The truth about Göbekli Tepe and the Anunnaki almost certainly lies somewhere more nuanced than either extreme claims. The site was built by humans, real people with stone tools and enormous determination. But who those people were, what they believed, what they knew, remains largely mysterious. The Sumerian myths are real, ancient texts that describe beings called Anunnaki who came from the sky and shaped humanity. But whether those texts are mythology, cultural memory, or something else entirely is a choice we make in interpretation. What we can say with certainty is that the past is stranger than we often assume, that human capability and ingenuity stretched back far deeper in time than was believed even a few decades ago, that catastrophes both terrestrial and possibly cosmic have shaped our history in ways we're only beginning to understand. Göbekli Tepe stands as a monument to mystery itself, to the gaps in our knowledge, to the questions that may never be fully answered. As you lie there in the darkness, your own breathing slowing, these ancient stones seem less distant than they did. They were built by people who watched the same stars you can see tonight, who felt the same wind, who asked the same fundamental questions about existence. They left those stones standing, carved with symbols we can see, but not fully understand, windows into a worldview that has vanished into time. Were the Anunnaki extraterrestrials? Were they human survivors of a lost civilization? Were they gods in the traditional sense? Or were they something we don't have a category for, beings or concepts that don't fit neatly into our modern frameworks of possible and impossible? The stones don't say, they stand silent, waiting, holding their secrets close after 12,000 years.